Cora Lindquist pinned the foreclosure notice to the barn door herself. She did it because the mail carrier hadn't the stomach to hand it to her. He'd come up the lane at first light, the envelope already sweating in his fist, and when she'd stepped out onto the porch, he couldn't meet her eyes. So he left it wedged in the screen door and drove off fast, gravel spitting behind his tires. She read it standing in the yard. The figure was there in black ink, plain as a brand. $2,160. Due the last day of harvest. 39 days off. She did not cry. She folded the paper once, walked it to the barn, and pinned it to the grayed wood where she'd have to look at it every morning. Then she picked up the milk pail and went and milked the cow, because the cow didn't know a thing about paper, and because her hands needed something honest to do. 3 days later, land agent Harlan Voss said his piece on the church steps. He said it on a Sunday, in front of the whole congregation, near 60 souls filing out into the autumn light. And he said it loud, so nobody would miss a word. 39 days, Miss Lindquist. He tipped his hat like it was a courtesy. Then the ground answers to the paper, not to sentiment. The drought had already burned 3 summers into that county. Her father's heart had gone bad in the second one. And somewhere in a bank office, the note on her family's land had been bought out from under them by strangers who'd never so much as stood in her father's kitchen. 60 people heard Voss say it. Not one of them said a word back. That same evening, a motorcar came up the Lindquist lane. It was a car no farm in Ransom County could afford. Long and dark and quiet, dust curling off the running boards. It stopped at the gate, and a man stepped out into the last of the light, the man who now held the note on everything she had left. And it was the boy she'd loved when she was 17. The one everybody swore had run off to the city and forgotten her. The one who never wrote. He shut the car door. He stood there in the honey light with his hat in his hand. If you believe it's never too late for the heart, if you believe some love isn't lost, only carried, waiting to be handed back, then this story is for you. Before we go on, do this old storyteller a kindness. Tap that subscribe button so these tales keep finding their way to your porch of an evening. And tell me, comment the town you're watching from tonight. I want to see how far Larkspur travels. Now, come back with me to the dry autumn of 1934 and let me tell you how the boy came home. Larkspur sat in the flat middle of Nebraska, where the sky did most of the talking. It was a small town then and getting smaller. A grain elevator, a church with a leaning steeple, a Grange hall, a 5 and dime, a bank with columns too grand for the money it held. And all around it, the quarter sections, the farms, stitched together with barbed wire and stubbornness. The Lindquist place was one of them. 160 acres of cropland and pasture, a white house gone gray, a barn, a windmill, a cottonwood tree older than the county. Cora ran it alone now. She had for 2 years, since the morning her father sat down at the breakfast table and couldn't get his breath, and the doctor came out and pressed his ear to Wendell Lindquist's chest and shook his head slow. Weak heart, he'd said. No fields for him, no heavy work, no worry, if it could be helped, and of course it couldn't. So it fell to Cora, 28 years old, and the whole place resting on her shoulders like a yoke. She rose before the sun and worked past it. She fed the hogs and milked the cow and mended the fence and drove the team and kept the ledger, and in the thin evenings she cooked for her father and read to him from the paper and helped him to his bed. The corn that year was poor. 3rd dry summer running. But it was standing. It was hers, and it was standing, and if the rain held off, and the frost held off, and the good Lord held off just a little longer, there'd be enough in the crib to make something of. Maybe not the whole 2,000, but something. She was not a hard woman, whatever the town came to say of her later. She still left the porch lamp burning at night, the way her mother had, for any drifter or hobo walking the rail line who might need a light to steer by. She still carried a dozen eggs down to the Reinhold place every Friday and traded them for a jar of honey and stayed to talk a while. Because Mrs. Reinhold was lonely, and so was she. She had a soft place in her, deep down. She'd just learned to keep it covered, the way you bank a fire you mean to keep overnight. Here is the thing about that land, and you should hold on to it. It hadn't come from her father's people. It had come from her mother's. Ingrid's grandfather had homesteaded that quarter section with his own 2 hands, broke the sod. Buried 2 children in the corner of the pasture under a little iron fence, and held on. It passed to Ingrid. Ingrid married Wendell Lindquist and brought the land with her like a dowry, and when Ingrid died, Cora was 19, the land became the last thing of her mother left in the world. The dishes wore out. The dresses were made over into other dresses. But the ground stayed. To lose the ground was to lose the last of Ingrid Lindquist. Cora knew that in her bones. It was why she'd have gone into the fire before she'd signed that note away. Now, there was a summer, 11 years back, that Cora didn't let herself think about anymore. She'd trained herself out of it, the way you train a dog off the furniture. But it was there, under the floor of her, and some nights it came up anyway. She was 17 that summer. And there was a boy, Emmett Vaughn, the blacksmith's son, from the far edge of town, all elbows and dark hair, and a way of going quiet when he had something real to say. They'd known each other since they were children throwing corncobs in the churchyard. But that summer it turned into something else, the way it does, all at once and without asking permission. They courted the way poor young people courted then. Long walks down the section line, sitting on the fence at dusk. A picnic once, by the creek, with cold biscuits and a whole afternoon of talk. He told her he meant to make something of himself, that he wouldn't stay a smith's boy shoeing horses his whole life, that he'd go where the money was and come back with enough to buy them a place of their own, and he'd say all this looking straight at her, not away. And she believed every word because he was the sort of boy you believed. The last night, she remembered it whole, though she tried not to. They'd stood under the old cottonwood on her mother's land. The leaves had that dry September rattle. And she'd taken something from her collar and pressed it into his palm and closed his fingers over it. It was her mother's wedding button. Mother of pearl, small as a thumbnail, off the collar of Ingrid's own wedding dress. The one thing of her mother's Cora carried on her person. She gave it to him. "So you carry something of mine," she said, "wherever you go." He'd looked at it in his hand like she'd given him a live coal. Then he'd closed his fingers and promised he'd write. Every week, he'd write. And when he had enough, he'd come back for her, and she should watch the lane. The next morning, Emmett Vaughn was gone. No letter came. Not that week, not the next, not the one after. Cora watched the lane the way you'd watch a wound, checking it every day and hating yourself for checking. Autumn passed. Winter, the letters didn't come. And the town, which loved a verdict better than it loved the truth, reached its verdict. The Vaughn boy had run off to the city and forgotten her, the way boys did. And Cora Lindquist had best learn her lesson and set her cap for someone steadier. She learned the lesson. She set the softness under a stone. And whatever was left of her 17th summer, she buried it in the corner of the pasture next to the little iron fence, and did not go there anymore. That was 11 years gone. And now his car was in her lane. She did not go down to the gate. She stood on the porch with the screen door between them, and she watched him take a step toward the house and stop when he saw her face. Whatever he'd rehearsed on the long road up from wherever he'd been, it left him. He turned his hat in his hands. "Cora," he said. "Mr. Vaughn." She gave the name to him cold, the way you'd hand back something that didn't fit. "You've had a wasted drive. There's nothing on this place that's any business of yours." He stopped. "That's the trouble. It is my business now. The note. I bought the note, Cora, out of the bank. I need you to understand, I understand fine." Her voice didn't rise. That was the frightening thing about Cora Lindquist. When she was angry, she got quieter. I understand that the rich man's come to take the poor girl's farm, and he's dressed it up as an old friend so it'll go down smoother. You can keep your paper, Mr. Vaughn, and you can get off my mother's land." He stood a moment longer, then he put his hat on, and he nodded once, and he got back in that quiet, dark car and drove down the lane and away. Inside, from the parlor, her father's voice came thin. "Cora?" "Who was that?" came up. "Nobody, Daddy," she said. "Just a man lost his way." By morning the whole county had it. Emmett Vaughn was back, the smith's son, gone all these years, and he'd come back rich. An agent for a big outfit called Meridian Farmland and Trust. All suits and motorcars, and a room at the good hotel. And the first thing he'd done, before he'd so much as shaken a hand, was buy up the Lindquist note. The town read it just as Cora had. The boy who'd thrown her over had come back to finish the job, to take her land now that he'd already taken her heart. They clucked over it at the store and the church. Poor Cora. First he leaves her, now this. Wasn't it always the way? Only it wasn't the way. But nobody in Larkspur knew that yet. Not even Cora, especially not Cora. The first strange thing happened 4 days after the car came up the lane. The windmill had been dying for a year. The old wooden vanes had cracked and gone slack, the head had rusted stiff on its pin, and it hadn't pumped a decent draw of water since spring. Cora had been hauling from the far well by hand, 2 buckets at a time, because there was no money for a new fan and no time to climb up and fight the old one. She came out that morning and the windmill was turning. Turning free and easy in the dawn breeze, the way it had when she was a girl. She stood in the wet grass and watched it go, and then she climbed the tower to see, because she couldn't believe it. Somebody had been up there in the dark. The head was greased slick. 3 of the vanes had been reset, and 2 of them were new, cut and shaped and bolted on by a hand that knew ironwork. Down at the base, the pump rod pulled clean, and water, real water, cold and silver, ran into the stock tank in a steady rope. She stood at the top of that tower a long time, the wind pulling at her dress, and she felt something she didn't want to feel, and she pushed it down. That same week, she went into the seed store in town to see how far behind she stood on the account. She stood a good deal behind. She knew that. She'd been carrying the bill since spring planting, and Mr. Ferris, the storekeeper, had been kind about it, but kindness had a bottom to it. Mr. Ferris took down the ledger and turned it to her and pointed. And where her balance should have been, $31 and some cents, she knew it to the penny, there was a line drawn through, and beside it. In Mr. Ferris's careful hand, 1 word. "Paid who?" Cora said. Her mouth had gone dry. "Who paid it, Mr. Ferris?" The old man wouldn't look at her. "Fella asked me not to say. Was it Gideon Reinhold?" Mr. Ferris opened his mouth and shut it and rubbed the back of his neck, and that was as much answer as he'd give. And Cora walked out into the street thinking it must have been Gideon. It made sense that it was Gideon. Gideon Reinhold was steady and decent and had been coming around the place all summer with a shy sort of hope, mending her gate latch without being asked, standing in her yard turning his own hat in his hands. Gideon was the kind of man who'd quietly pay a woman's seed bill and never breathe a word. It made sense that it was Gideon. So she let herself believe it was Gideon. Because the other thought, the thought of who it really was, she could not afford to hold. Not with 39 days shrinking down and her mother's land pinned to a barn door. It was not Gideon. But she wouldn't know that for a while yet. Her aunt saw the truth before she did. Aunt Bess, her mother's sister, sharp-eyed and soft-hearted, keeper of the family's memory and of Ingrid's old cedar trunk, was in town the day Emmett Vaughn stood on the corner outside the bank, waiting on somebody, checking the time. He drew out his pocket watch. And it was the chain Bess noticed, not the watch. Hanging off the watch chain, worn smooth as a river stone, was a small pale button, mother of pearl, thumbnail-sized. He thumbed it once, absent. the way a man touches a thing he's touched 10,000 times, and put the watch away. Aunt Bess knew that button. She'd sat beside her sister Ingrid the day it was sewn to a wedding collar. She stood on the corner of that dusty street and looked at that button on the rich man's watch chain, and she did the arithmetic, and she said not one word to a living soul. Some truths you don't hand over. You let them arrive on their own feet, in their own time. But she did say one thing. Later, sitting in Cora's kitchen with a cup of coffee going cold between her hands. And she said it light. The way you drop a stone in a well to hear how deep it goes. You know, back when, she said, old Mr. Voss handled all the Lindquist mail through the bank. Anything came for this house, come through his hands first. Funny, the things you remember. Cora wasn't listening. Cora was at the stove with her mind on the note. And the stone dropped down into the well and made no sound she could hear. Not yet. That old Mr. Voss had a son. Harlan Voss was 40, and he'd inherited his father's bank and his father's contempt and none of his father's caution. Where the old man had squeezed the county quietly, Harlan squeezed it loud. These were the Depression years, and there was a cruel kind of money to be made off a dying farm country, and Harlan Voss meant to make all of it. He bought up notes the way other men bought penny candy. Foreclosed, sold off. And lately he'd got himself involved in something bigger, a rail siding scheme. A spur line the railroad wanted to run through the flat-bottom ground east of Larkspur, and every farm along that line worth 10 times its dirt if a man could get his hands on it before the farmers knew. The Lindquist quarter sat square on that line. Voss had wanted that note. He'd gone to buy it himself, and found he'd been beaten to it. Beaten by a smith's boy in a good suit, an outsider agent from Meridian, who'd walked in and paid cash and walked out with the very paper Harlan Voss coveted most. And that was a thing Harlan Voss could not forgive. He circled the Lindquist place after that like a dog that's been shown a bone and had it snatched back. He was in no hurry. He had 39 days, and then 35, and then 30, and he meant to be standing there when the paper came due, whoever held it. Because paper was paper, and in the end it always answered to men like him. Or so he believed. The Grange Hall held its harvest dance the third week in September, the way it did every year, drought or no drought. It was the one night the whole tired county put on its better clothes and pretended, for a few hours, that the world was as it used to be. There were fiddles and a caller. There was cider and a long table of food nobody could quite spare and brought anyway. There were lanterns strung across the rafters, and the plank floor swept and waxed, and out in the dark the motorcars and the wagons and the saddle horses all crowded together in the grange yard. Cora almost didn't go. But Aunt Bess wouldn't hear of it. She came out to the farm that afternoon with her arms full and her mind made up, and she sat Cora down and did over her one good dress. Ingrid's dress, made over twice already, the blue gone soft with washing, took it in at the waist and let out the hem and pinned a bit of lace at the collar that had been Ingrid's too. And she brushed out Cora's dark hair, that heavy hair the color of good soil, and pinned it up, and when she was done she turned Cora to the little mirror and said, "There. Let 'em look." They looked. She came into the Grange Hall on Aunt Bess's arm, and heads turned, and for a moment, just a moment, Cora Lindquist forgot the note pinned to her barn. She was young. There was fiddle music. And she was, though she'd have denied it to her grave, a beautiful woman, the kind that hard work and grief only cut down closer to the bone of her. Then Harlan Voss saw her. He'd been drinking. Not falling down, but enough to loosen the last strap on his meanness. He stood near the cider table with two of his men, and when Cora came in he raised his cup and raised his voice, and he made sure the voice carried to every corner of that hall. "Well now," he called out. "Look who's dressed for a ball." The Lindquist charity case. A few nervous laughs, the caller's fiddle faltered. Voss grinned and pressed on, delighted with his own cruelty. "Folks, enjoy the fine gown. Enjoy it while it lasts. Because in a few short weeks that farm goes on the block, dress and all, and this little Cinderella's coach turns back into a manure spreader. He laughed at that. Sentiment don't pay a note, sweetheart, I keep telling you. The ground answers to the paper. The hall went dead quiet. 60 faces, and not one of them looked at Cora, because it hurt too much to look. She stood in her mother's made-over dress with her chin up and her face burning and her whole body turned to stone, and she made herself not run, because running was the one thing worse than staying. And then a chair scraped back at the edge of the room. Emmett Vaughn stood up. Nobody had much noticed him come in. He'd been sitting in the shadow by the door in his good dark suit, quiet as he'd always been quiet, and now he stood, and he crossed that whole waxed floor in the dead silence, his heels loud on the planks, straight through the middle of the room to where Cora stood. He didn't look at Voss at all. He looked at Cora. And he held out his hand. "Miss Lindquist," he said, "would you do me the honor?" It was not a question. It was a rope thrown to a drowning woman, and she took it because there was nothing else to take. She put her hand in his. And Emmett Vaughn turned his head, at last, toward Harlan Voss, and he spoke, not loud. He never was loud, but the hall was so silent you could have heard a moth in the lanterns. "The lady's accounts," Emmett said, "are between her and the man who holds them. That's me, not you. You've no more claim on this woman's name than you've got on the moon." He let that sit. "Fiddler, if you please." For a heartbeat nothing moved. Then the fiddler, God bless him, laid bow to string and struck up a waltz. And Emmett Vaughn put his hand at the small of Cora Lindquist's back and turned her out onto the floor, and the whole Grange Hall let out a breath it had been holding, and the judgment of the county turned over in the air like a coin coming down the other way. Poor Cora, they'd said. Now they weren't so sure. Now they looked at the tall, quiet man holding her like she was made of something worth holding, and they weren't so sure of anything anymore. Harlan Voss set down his cup and left. And the dance went on without him, and it was better for his leaving. Cora didn't speak the whole first turn around the floor. She couldn't. Her heart was going too hard for words. And Emmett didn't push. He just held her, careful, at a proper distance, and moved her through the waltz the way you'd lead a spooked mare, all patience, giving her the time. At last she got out. "Lo, you shouldn't have done that. Somebody had to." "I don't need rescuing, Mr. Vaughn, no," he agreed. "I don't expect you ever did." And something in the plain way he said it undid a knot in her she hadn't known was tied. She looked up at him then, really looked, for the first time in 11 years. He'd aged. There was gray coming at his temples and lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when he was a boy under the cottonwood. But it was him. The same steady dark eyes. The same way of going quiet with something real behind it. "Why'd you buy the note?" she said. The truth. Not the agent's answer. Why? And for just a second she saw it. Something moved behind his face. Something he wanted badly to say and couldn't. Or wouldn't. Not there. Not yet. His hand tightened at her back. Then the shutter came down, and he said, "Because I'd rather it was in my hands than in Harlan Voss's. That's the God's truth as far as it goes." As far as it goes. She heard the edge of the withheld thing in it, but the waltz was ending, and the moment closed, and she stepped back from him, with her cheeks warm and her mind a storm. And she did not thank him, and she did not need to. He knew. She rode home that night in Aunt Bess's buggy with the stars thrown wide across the sky, and she did not say a word the whole way, and Aunt Bess, wise old thing, did not make her. The days after the dance ran short and hard. The corn wouldn't wait on anybody's feelings. She'd known for a week she couldn't bring in that harvest alone. It was too much ground for one woman and a sick old man and a hired boy she couldn't pay. And every ear left standing when the frost came was money left in the field, and money left in the field was the farm lost. She'd lain awake over it, the arithmetic grinding in the dark. 39 days had become 22. 22 days to cut and shock and crib enough corn to make 2,000. $160, and she could not do it alone, and there was no one to hire, and there was one man in the whole county with the means and the will to help her. She hated that it was him. She rode over to the hotel in town, and she sat in that car of his out front where the town could see and talk all it liked, and she said it fast so she wouldn't lose her nerve. "I'll not have you thinking this changes anything," she said. "I still don't know what you are. But I can't bring the crop in alone, and you hold the note, and it's as much your interest as mine that it comes in. So, if you mean to help, help. As a business matter. Nothing else. No promises. You understand me?" "I understand you," Emmett said. "Say it back." "No promises," he said. "As a business matter. I'll be there at first light." He was there at first light. And he was there every morning after. Now I want you to see it, because this is where the ice began to go. Not all at once. Ice doesn't go all at once. It goes in degrees, a little at the edges each warm day, until one morning you look and the pond is open water and you never quite saw it happen. They worked the fields side by side, the two of them and Wendell where he could sit, and the hired boy when Emmett quietly saw the boy paid. Emmett Vaughn worked like a smith's son, and not like a man in a good suit. He shed the suit for canvas and rough boots, and got the dirt of her family's land under his fine city fingernails, and he did not complain, and he did not slack, and he did not once, in all those days, ask her for a single thing. The corn binder broke on the fourth day. The knotter jammed, and a casting cracked. The kind of break that stops a harvest cold and can't be fixed short of the town smith, and money there wasn't. Cora stood over it near tears, and Emmett knelt down in the stubble and looked at it a long while, and then he asked for the forge. Her father's old cold forge, gone to rust in the corner of the machine shed. Emmett cleaned it and fired it and stood at it half the night, sparks flying, and by morning he'd forged the broken casting whole again with his own two hands, the way his father had taught him before he was ever anybody's land agent. The binder ran. Cora watched it eat down the rows, and she looked at the man wiping soot off his face, and the ice went a degree. The first laugh got out of her on the 9th day. She didn't mean it to. A hog got loose from the pen during the noon dinner and led the three of them a chase across the barnyard, Emmett Vaughn in his fine reputation diving full length into the mud and coming up with the shoat in his arms and the most astonished look on his face, plastered head to foot in muck, and Cora laughed. Out loud. The first real laugh in longer than she could name. And Emmett, sitting there in the mud holding a squealing pig, laughed too, and for one moment they were 17 again, and neither of them said so. That was the day she stopped saying Mr. Vaughn. It slipped out at the supper table without her deciding it. Pass the bread, Emmett, just that. And she heard herself say it, and so did he, and neither of them made anything of it. But something had crossed over that couldn't cross back. There was an evening they hauled the last load in ahead of a storm, a black wall of cloud come rolling up from the southwest, and half the shocked corn still in the field, and if the rain hit it wet before it was cribbed it, would mold and be worth nothing. They raced it, all of them, even Wendell up on the wagon seat handing down what he could. The team lathered, and the wind rising, and the first fat drops smacking the dust, and they got it. Got the last of it under roof as the sky broke open, and stood in the crib doorway soaked and gasping and grinning like fools while the rain came down in ropes. And it was on that wagon, going out for that last load, that Cora saw the thing that broke the story she'd told herself for 11 years. Her father had dozed off on the wagon seat, worn out, his chin down on his chest. And Emmett, without a word, took off his own coat, his good coat, and laid it over the old man's shoulders against the coming rain, and tucked it gentle, the way you'd tuck a child. And in reaching, his watch chain swung loose from his vest and hung down in the gray light. Cora saw the button. Small, pale, mother of pearl. Worn smooth as a river stone by 10 years of a thumb. Her mother's wedding button. The one she'd pressed into a boy's palm under the cottonwood and never seen again and given up for lost along with the boy. He had it. He had carried it. 11 years, through whatever life had taken him through, in whatever cities, in good times and bad. He had carried her mother's button on his watch chain where his hand could find it, and he had it now. Cora sat very still on that wagon with the storm coming, and the whole verdict of the town. He ran off, he forgot her, he threw her over, cracked straight down the middle like river ice in spring. Because a man who forgets you does not carry your mother's buttons smooth with 10 years of touching. He forgot me, she'd told herself, so she could stand to live. And here in her hand was the proof that he had not. That something else had happened 11 years ago that she did not understand. That the story had a piece missing from the middle of it, and the piece had been there all along, hanging off a rich man's watch chain in the rain. She didn't say anything. She turned her face out to the storm so he wouldn't see it, and she let the first crack run through her, and she did not know yet whether it was a crack toward joy or toward some worse grief still waiting. It was Aunt Bess who opened the trunk. She came out to the farm the next Sunday, the harvest all but in, and she brought the old cedar trunk down from her attic in the back of the wagon. Ingrid's trunk that had sat closed for near 10 years. She said it was time Cora had her mother's things, with the way the world was going, and no more excuses. And she and Cora knelt on the parlor floor in the lamplight and lifted the lid, and the smell of cedar and old lavender came up out of it like a ghost getting to its feet. There were Ingrid's things. A shawl. A packet of pressed flowers gone to paper. The wedding dress, folded in muslin, with the empty place at the collar where one button was missing. Cora touched that empty place a long time. And down under the dress, folded small, in her mother's own hand, there was a note. Cora unfolded it by the lamp. The ink had gone brown. But the words were her mother's, and her mother had been dead near 10 years, and here she was speaking anyway, the way the dead do when you finally open the trunk. Cora read it twice. And her hand began to shake. Because it was about her. And it was about Emmett. It was dated that same lost autumn, in the weeks before Ingrid took sick and died. And it was addressed to no one, and to everyone. The way a woman writes a thing she needs to say and can't say out loud. Cora set the note down in her lap and looked at Aunt Bess. And Aunt Bess looked back at her with eyes full of everything she'd been keeping for 10 years. And outside the window the porch lamp burned for a drifter who wasn't coming, and neither of them said a word. And the note lay open in the lamplight, with the dead woman's warning waiting on it, still unspoken aloud, hanging in that quiet room like the last breath before a door comes open. Cora read it aloud, because Aunt Bess asked her to, and because a thing like that ought to be said in a voice and not just in the eye. To my Cora, it began. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and the trunk is open, and you are old enough to need it. There is a thing I could not fix in my life, so I am setting it down for you to fix in yours. The Vaughn boy loves you. I have watched him look at you across the churchyard, and it is the same look your father gave me, before pride ate the sweetness out of him. Do not let your father's pride cost you your heart the way mine near cost me mine. If Emmett is gone, there is a reason, and the reason is not that he forgot you. A man does not forget a girl the way that boy does not forget you. Find the reason, and when you find it, forgive it. Love is not lost, Cora, it is only carried a while by whoever is strong enough to carry it, until it can be handed back. Cora's voice broke on the last line, and she did not try to mend it. For a long time she sat on the parlor floor with the brown ink swimming in front of her. Her mother had known. 10 years dead, and her mother had known more about her own life than she had. The porch lamp threw its little light on the window glass. Somewhere out past the barn a coyote said one thing and quit. You saw the button, Cora said at last. It was not a question. On the street. First day he was back. Aunt Bess folded her hands. I knew it the second I saw it. Your mother's wedding button, worn smooth as a river stone from a man's thumb. 11 years of a thumb, Cora. You don't wear a thing that smooth by forgetting it. Why didn't you tell me? Because you'd have thrown it back in his face. Bess said it plain, no cruelty in it. You were not ready to hear it. A body has to open its own trunk. Cora looked at the note. She looked at the empty place at the collar of the wedding dress, folded in its muslin, where one button had gone missing 11 years ago under a cottonwood tree. She thought of a 17-year-old boy's palm closing over it. She thought of 39 days, of which fewer than 30 now remained. And she felt something turn over in her chest that had been lying still and hard for a decade. She did not cry. She had milked a cow the morning the foreclosure notice came, and she was not going to cry now, but she folded her mother's note along its old creases and put it in her apron pocket, over her heart, and she said, "Then I had better go find the reason." The next morning she hitched the wagon and drove into Larkspur alone. The Meridian office sat on the corner where the old harness shop used to be, with fresh gilt letters on the glass. Meridian Farmland and Trust. Cora went up the 2 steps in her good boots and pushed the door open without knocking, and there was Harlan Voss behind a desk that did not belong to him, in a suit that cost more than her seed corn, with the Lindquist ledger open in front of him like he already owned the ground it stood for. Miss Lindquist. He did not rise. Come to sign it over early? I've come to tell you how it's going to be. Cora set her hand flat on the ledger and shut it. The note is $2,160. I mean to pay it, every cent, by the last day of harvest, out of my own crop and my own hogs and my own hand. And when it's paid, you and your railmen will keep off my father's ground. You will not survey it. You will not walk it. You will not so much as spit across the line fence. Voss leaned back. He was 40 years old and he wore his father's watch and his father's contempt. And if the crop comes short, then it comes short, and you'll have one honest, for once in your life. But you'll not have this place cheap, because you frightened a sick old man. I'll die on it first. Bold talk from a girl who can't make the figure. I can make the figure. Cora straightened. She was aware, distantly, of the clerk in the corner pretending to file papers and hearing every word. Emmett Vaughn holds the note. Not you. However much you wanted it, you didn't get it. That must sit like a stone in you, Mr. Voss, that the boy from the smithy came home rich enough to buy the paper out from under you. It's the whole reason you can't leave us be. Something moved behind his eyes. She'd struck bone. But he only smiled. Vaughn holds the paper today, he said. Ask yourself who holds it tomorrow. Meridian is a company, Miss Lindquist, not a sweetheart. Companies foreclose. That's the whole of what they do. He slid the ledger back toward himself, 39 days, now 30. Then the ground answers to the paper, not to sentiment. We'll see what the ground answers to, Cora said, and she walked out with her chin up. And she did not let him see her hands were shaking until she was back on the wagon seat. But she had done it. She had stopped waiting. She had gone into the lion's own office and put her hand on the ledger. And driving home under the wide brown sky, with the note in her apron pocket and her mother's words folded over her heart, Cora Lindquist felt for the first time in 39 days like a woman who might win. They brought the harvest in together after that. No promises between them, just work. Emmett came at first light in the motorcar and left it at the road and walked the last quarter mile so the neighbors wouldn't talk, though the neighbors talked anyway. He shed the fine coat and rolled his sleeves, and he worked like a man who'd been raised to it, which he had, before the money. They shocked the thin corn and hauled it to the crib. When the old binder threw its nodder on the 4th day, Emmett lay under it in the stubble for 2 hours with grease to the elbow and made it run again, and Cora crouched beside him passing wrenches. And when it caught and clattered back to life, they both laughed at once, the first laugh, and she heard herself and stopped, surprised, like a woman who'd forgotten she owned the sound. Mr. Vaughn, she started. Emmett, he said, not looking up, wiping the nodder clean. You've called me Mr. Vaughn for 3 weeks. I've been Emmett to you since you were 15. I'd take it as a kindness. She was quiet a moment. Then, Emmett, she said. And it was the second thing to turn over in her chest, the smallest word, and it cost her, and she gave it anyway. Her father rode the wagon some days, when his heart allowed, sitting up on the seat wrapped against a cold that wasn't in the air, watching the young people work. One noon he dozed off with the reins slack in his hands, and Cora looked up from the shocks to see Emmett take off his own coat and lay it over the old man's knees, careful, the way you'd cover a child, and then step back and say nothing about it. Wendell never woke. Emmett never mentioned it. But Cora saw. She was seeing a great many things now that the trunk was open. She saw the button, too, up close when he reached across her for the water dipper. The little mother-of-pearl button on his watch chain caught the light not a foot from her face, and there was no mistaking it. Her mother's button, worn to a soft gleam, carried against a man's ribs for 11 years, through whatever city he'd been in, through whatever he'd become. She looked at it, and she looked at his face, brown and older and honest in the noon light, and the last of the hard thing in her chest cracked clean down the middle. He had not forgotten her. He had carried her. All those years the whole county called him the boy who ran off and forgot. He had been walking around with her mother's wedding button worn smooth against his heart. She wanted then to ask him, "Why? Why did you go? Why did no letter come?" But she was afraid of the answer the way you're afraid of a doctor's door, and so she said nothing, and they worked, and the days ran down toward the deadline like water finding the low place. They counted the money on the parlor table by lamplight, the two of them and sometimes Wendell. The grain sold. The hogs sold, all but the sow. Egg money in a coffee tin. Bess's little store of coins pressed on them over Cora's protest. Every evening the pile grew, and the gap to $2,160 narrowed, and every evening Cora noticed a thing she said nothing about. That Emmett, who worked harder than any man there, never once ate at the noon table. He'd take his plate and walk it out to the wagon and be gone an hour, and she understood at last that he was not eating it at all. He was leaving his share for the Lindquists. A rich man, going hungry through the noon of a working day, so a sick old farmer and his daughter would have enough. She learned how he took his coffee, black, no sugar, hands wrapped round the cup like a man who'd been cold once and never forgot it, and she learned it the way you learn a thing you mean to keep. There was a moment at the granary door on the 9th day. He handed her up a sack and their hands met on the burlap and neither one let go, not right away, in the grain dust and the slanting light. Close enough she could see the fleck of gray already coming at his temple. His thumb moved once against the back of her hand. Then a wagon turned in at the road and they stepped apart, and the moment closed like a book, and both of them carried the place it had been for the rest of the day. It was Aunt Bess who found the letters. She was helping Cora put Ingrid's things back into the cedar trunk near the end when her hand went down under the false lift tray at the bottom, into a space Cora hadn't known was there, and came up with a bundle. Yellowed envelopes tied with a bootlace. Cora took them to the lamp. They were addressed to her. To Miss Cora Lindquist, in a young man's hand she'd have known blind. The same hand that had carved her initials in the cottonwood the summer she was 17. And they were unopened. Every one. The seals never broken. Postmarked from a city 2 states east, one after another, one a month, for a year. 12 letters. 12 that had come to Larkspur and never come to her. Cora's fingers went cold. "How?" she said. "How did these?" And that was when the whole thing came apart, on the last day of harvest, out on the courthouse square, in front of the town. Voss had arranged it. Of course he had. He'd got word the Lindquists meant to pay, and he could not abide it, and so he'd pushed a courthouse step auction to the morning after the final day, banking on the crop coming short, banking on old fear. Certain that when the county gathered to watch the Lindquist quarter sold off, no farmer's daughter would find the nerve or the money to stop it. And the county came. Near 60 souls, the same faces that had heard him mock her at the Grange dance, gathered in the harvest dust below the courthouse steps to see how it would end. Cora came with the money. All of it. Made at last, in a canvas bag she held against her like a child, $2,160 counted 3 times. And Emmett was to have been on the morning train. She'd heard he'd bought a ticket east, heard it from Ferris at the seed store. And she had not let herself think about why. But when she pushed up through the crowd to the auctioneer's rail, there was Emmett Vaughn, not on any train, standing at the top of the courthouse steps with the Lindquist note in his hand. And there was Voss beside him, and Voss had a paper of his own, and Voss got the first word, because men like Voss always got the first word. Before the young lady empties her little sack, he said loud, to the crowd, she ought to know what she's buying. She ought to know the truth of her fine rescuer. He turned, showman that he was, and pointed at Emmett. This man did not leave Larkspur 11 years ago to seek his fortune. He was sent, paid to go, by her own father. The crowd stirred. Cora felt it go through her like cold water. "That's a lie," she said. "Is it, Wendell?" Voss found the old man in the crowd and fixed on him, and every head turned to Wendell Lindquist, gray and shaking on his feet, held up by Gideon Reinholdt's arm. "Tell your girl. Tell her how you came to my father's bank 11 years back, drowning in a debt you'd hid from your own family, about to lose the very ground her mother homesteaded. And tell her the bargain you struck to save it. Send the Smith's boy away, a penniless nothing, sniffing after your daughter, and the bank would carry your note quiet, and no one in the county would ever know Wendell Lindquist near went under. You sold the boy to save your pride." Voss smiled, thin. "And my father's bank held every letter that boy wrote her for a year and put them in a drawer. 12 of them. So the girl would think herself forgotten and marry sensible. It worked a treat, didn't it? Right up till today." The square had gone dead silent. Cora stood with the canvas bag against her chest and the yellowed letters, which she had brought folded in her coat, seeming to burn there. She looked at her father. And Wendell Lindquist could not meet her eyes, and that was the whole answer, plain as a slammed door. "And here's the sweetest part," Voss went on, warming, holding up his own paper now. "You think this man came back for love? He's Meridian Farmland and Trust. Read the charter. The company he agents for is positioned to take this quarter whether he burns your note or blesses it. He's not your savior, Miss Lindquist. He's the same trap in a kinder coat. He held your daddy's leash 11 years ago and he holds your mortgage now, and a man who holds you twice, that's enough." Cora said it quiet, but it cut across the square, and Voss stopped. She turned to Emmett, and here was the thing she had dreaded worse than losing the farm. That the reason her mother told her to find would turn out to be a reason she could not forgive. Her face was white. "You knew," she said. "All this time you worked my fields and covered my father with your coat and let me learn to say your name again. You knew he sent you off. You knew about the letters. And you said nothing. Cora, you held the note." Her voice did not rise. It didn't have to. "You should have told me you also held the truth." And she saw it land on him. She saw the man who'd carried her mother's button for 11 years take the blow standing, the way he took every blow. And she saw him decide, you could watch him decide it, right there on the courthouse steps, that her pride would never bend far enough to hear the rest, and that he would not beg. He had come home rich, and he had greased her windmill in the dark and gone hungry at noon, and he had learned that money and quiet were not enough to mend 11 years of silence, and now he believed the silence had won. "Then I'll say it plain," Emmett said. "Not to her. To the town." He turned and faced the 60 souls in the harvest dust, and he held up the Lindquist note where every eye could see it. "Harlan Voss is right about one thing," he said. "I was sent away. A boy of 20, told by the man he respected most that if he ever wrote or ever came back, he'd finish Wendell Lindquist and shame the girl he loved. So I went. And I wrote anyway, once a month, a year of it. Because a boy's a fool, and a fool keeps hoping. And every letter I wrote came home to a drawer in the Voss bank instead of to her hand." He looked at Voss. "Your father's drawer. Your family's kindness." He held the note higher. Voss says I came back to hold her twice. Here's the truth of it. And Emmett Vaughn laid the mortgage note flat on the iron auction rail at the top of the courthouse steps, and he took a match from his vest, and he struck it on the rail, and he set the paper afire in front of the whole county. This paper, he said. And his voice carried now, hard and clear over the crackle of it, said the Lindquist ground belongs to whoever holds it. I bought it out of that bank the day I came home. Not to foreclose. To keep it out of his hands. He nodded at Voss. I held it for one reason, so no other man ever could. That's the whole of it. There's your land baron, Larkspur, a man who spent his fortune to burn his own claim to ash. The note curled up black on the rail. 160 acres, $2,160, 39 days of terror, gone up in a thread of smoke on the morning air. Cora watched it burn and could not breathe. But Emmett was not done. He reached into his coat and brought out a second sheaf of papers, thick, and he turned to the front of the crowd where the sheriff stood. Old Tom Aldous with his hat pushed back. And these are for you, Sheriff, Emmett said. Meridian's Ransom County files. Harlan Voss has been foreclosing farms across 3 counties for that rail siding scheme of his. The Peterson place, the Kolb place, the Munch Quarter, and every one of them was foreclosed on arrears that were never owed, falsified, figures penciled in that the farmers never ran up, then called past due when they couldn't pay a debt that wasn't theirs. He wanted the Lindquist Quarter for the same siding, at the same crooked price. It's all here. Signed in his own hand. He held them out. I'm agent for Meridian. I've spent 2 years quietly buying my way in close enough to get these. That's why I came home when I did. Not just for her. For this. The sheriff took the papers. He read the first page, and the second, standing there in the dust, and the square held its breath. And then it broke over Harlan Voss like weather. He'd gone the color of tallow. His hand came out toward the sheaf in the sheriff's fist, grabbing at papers that were not his anymore. Those are company documents. Those are stolen, Aldous. You can't. I can read, Harlan. The sheriff turned another page. His jaw had set. Peterson came to me last spring swearing he never owed that money. I told him the bank don't make mistakes. He looked up, and there was something terrible and quiet in the old man's face. Seems the bank makes them on purpose. This is Vaughn's word against. It's your signature, Harlan, against your signature. The sheriff folded the papers under his arm. You'll want to come along and explain it. All of it. The Munch Quarter especially. Munch hanged himself in his barn in March, and now I'm going to want to know exactly what he thought he owed you. Voss looked around the square for a friendly face and found 60 that weren't. The men whose farms sat next in his ledger. The women who'd buried Munch. He backed up a step. His fine hat was crooked, and he did not fix it. You'll regret this, he said, to no one, to all of them, and it came out thin as a boy's. Then he turned and walked down the courthouse steps alone. Through a crowd that parted for him the way you part for something spoiled, and he got into his waiting car, and he drove out of Larkspur, and Ransom County was well shut of him. Nobody watched him go. They were all looking at Wendell Lindquist. The old man had come apart. He stood swaying in Gideon's grip with the tears running down into the white stubble of his jaw, and he pulled free. And he crossed to where his daughter stood with the canvas bag still clutched senseless against her, and the ashes of the note blowing off the rail behind her. It was me, Cora. His voice was a ruin. Everything he said. I did it. I was so deep in debt to that bank I couldn't see daylight. And I was proud. God help me. I was proud. And I couldn't bear for you to know your daddy'd near lost your mother's ground. So I sent the boy off, and I let them take his letters, and I let you grieve a thing that wasn't so for 11 years to save my own face. His hand found her arm. Your mother knew. She found out at the last, and it broke her, and I think it helped kill her, carrying it. She left you a note. I never had the courage to. I'm a coward, Cora. I sold your happiness to keep my name clean, and it wasn't worth the paper that boy just burned. And Cora Lindquist looked at her father, 63 years old and weeping on the courthouse steps in front of the whole county, and she felt the anger that ought to have come, and under it, faster, she felt her mother's brown ink. Forgive it. When you find the reason, forgive it. Because pride had done this. The same pride Ingrid had warned her runs in the blood, that had eaten the sweetness out of Wendell the way it had near hardened Cora herself into a woman who'd sooner lose a farm than say a man's Christian name. "I know, Daddy," she said. And she put her arms around the old man and held him up, there where everyone could see. And that was her answer, and it was enough. And the father loop that had been open 11 years drew quietly shut. Gideon Reinhold was the one who stepped back. He'd stood by Cora a year, steady and decent, never once cruel, and he'd hoped, everyone knew he'd hoped. And now he looked from Cora to the ash on the rail to Emmett Vaughn standing spent at the top of the steps, and he understood the way a good man understands. He came to Cora and he took off his hat, all the way off, and he held it against his chest. "He's the better man," Gideon said. "Simple. I always halfway knew it." "You go on, Cora," and he put his hat back on and tipped it once to Emmett. One nod. Man to man, the whole of his dignity kept, and he walked back into the crowd, and if it cost him, and it did, he never let the county see the price. Cora would remember that. She'd bring the Reinhold's eggs the rest of her life, and neither of them would ever say why. And the town, the same near 60 souls that had stood in the Grange Hall and let Voss call her the Lindquist charity case, that had whispered rich man come to take the poor girl's land, the town stood silent a moment in the settling dust. Then somebody at the back started it, one pair of hands, and it spread, and the courthouse square that had gathered to watch a woman lose everything broke into cheering instead, for the blacksmith's boy who came home and burned his own fortune to keep a promise nobody had let him keep. Cora crossed the steps to him. The same steps. Where she'd stood a month ago and heard Voss reduce her whole life to a figure due. She crossed them now through the noise and the dust with her mother's note in her apron and 11 years falling off her shoulders, and she came to Emmett Vaughn, who stood there certain she'd never bend. Certain the silence had won, watching her come with his heart in his mouth and no idea what she'd do. She took his hand. The first touch that was a choice and not an accident. Not grain dust, not a dipper reached across. Not a moment that closed like a book. Her hand around his in front of God and Larkspur and her weeping father and the good man walking away. Chosen. She felt him startle. And then she felt his fingers close over hers, over the calluses her own work had put there. And neither of them said a word, because some things are said better in the hand than in the mouth. They read the last letter that night. By the lamp, in the parlor, with Wendell asleep at last and the porch light burning out the window for a drifter who wasn't coming. Cora had the 12 letters on her lap. She'd steamed them open one by one that evening, her hands not quite steady, and read a year of a young man's heart written into the dark and mailed into a drawer. But it was the last one she read aloud to him, the 12th, the one where a boy of 21 had finally given up hoping. "If this one comes back like the others," she read, her voice low, "then I'll know you never wanted them, and I'll stop, and I'll try to build a life that has a shape without you in it. But I don't believe it, Cora. I think somewhere the letters are being kept from you. Because I can't make the world work any other way in my head. So I'll say it once more in case this is the one that gets through. I love you. I have your mother's button, and I'll carry it till you take it back off me. And it is never too late. Whatever year it is when you read this, it is not too late. Come find me, or wait for me, and I will come. Yours, Emmett." She put the letter down. The date on it was 10 years gone. "It got through," she said. 10 years late. It got through. She looked up at him across the lamp. "You want to know my answer?" He couldn't speak. He nodded. And Cora Lindquist, who had a whole heart's worth of things she might have said, who had a mother's blessing and 11 years and a burned mortgage and a courthouse full of witnesses behind her, gave him just the one word, because it was the only one that carried all the rest. Stay, the wheat came up green in the spring of 1935. Third dry summer had broken at last into a wet, kind April, and the Lindquist quarter, Ingrid's people's 160 acres, saved, ran green from the road to the far fence in long, soft waves under a sky washed clean. The porch lamp still burned each evening. Cora lit it out of habit now, and not out of need, for the drifter who might come. Because her mother had lit it, and her mother's mother before that, and some lights you keep going, just because they've always gone. Wendell was stronger. The confession had taken a weight off his chest that his heart had been carrying longer than his doctor knew. And he walked the fence lines slow in the mornings and named the birds. They were married under the cottonwood. The same cottonwood where a girl of 17 had once pressed a wedding button into a boy's palm and said, "Carry something of mine." Aunt Bess had taken the button off the watch chain at last, worn to a soft milk gleam by 11 years of a man's thumb, and sewn it back onto the collar of Ingrid's wedding dress into the empty place that had waited for it. So that the dress was whole again after 11 years, and Cora wore her mother's dress with her mother's button at her throat and her mother's blessing folded in a Bible in her hands. Wendell gave her away. He was steady on his feet that day. He put her hand in Emmett's under the cottonwood where it had all begun, and he held on to both of them a moment before he let go, and he did not weep. And that was its own kind of healing. There was a car on the road as they came out of the churchyard after. A plain one, going through, not stopping, Harlan Voss, out on bond, and much diminished, the rail scheme collapsed, and the fraud files with the county court, moving on to somewhere that hadn't heard of him yet. He slowed at the sight of the wedding party under the tree. Cora saw him see her, in her mother's dress with the button at her collar, on the arm of the man he'd tried to make into a villain. She didn't scowl, she didn't turn away. She lifted her chin, and across the June air she gave him the one dry line she'd been saving without knowing she was saving it. The ground still answers to sentiment, Mr. Voss, a small smile. Turns out it always did. He drove on. And that was the last Larkspur ever saw of him. That evening the two of them sat on the porch of the house Ingrid's people had homesteaded, with the green wheat whispering out past the yard and the light going long and gold across it, the way the light does in a place that has been loved a long time. Emmett had his coffee. Black, no sugar. His hands wrapped round the cup out of an old habit of being cold. The porch lamp came on behind them, warm in the window. Cora leaned into his shoulder and felt her mother's button at her own throat, come all the way home now, off the watch chain and onto the dress, and against her heart where it started. Some love is not lost. That's the thing her mother knew, and wrote in brown ink, and left in a cedar trunk for a girl too proud to hear it any other way. Some love is only carried a while, by whoever is strong enough to carry it, through whatever years and whatever silence, until the day it can be handed back. Emmett Vaughn had carried hers for 11 years worn smooth against his ribs. And she had carried his without even knowing, and here at the end of it, on a porch in the green spring of 1935, it was handed back at last, and kept. The lamp burned. The wheat moved. And they sat there together in the last of the light, two people who'd been given a second chance and were wise enough, this time, to take it. If this story warmed something in you tonight, comment the town you're watching from. I'd love to see how far Larkspur has traveled.